the notes that I was jotting down as everybody was presenting today was basically each person that presented is rethinking something, which made me think about the term rethinking, which we say all the time, which sort of implies that we have never thought before, which really isn't the case with new urbanists. But if there was a common thread among everything that we just saw presented, it was that they were taking something that is generally unexamined, whether it's a building typology or how we live in the building or how we work in the buildings or how we produce and deliver buildings or how we fund buildings or how we think of a block and even how we own the land and what the ownership structure is. A lot of that stuff is handed down, and Steve Mazan has always talked a lot about living traditions, and a lot about how we develop things is done out of convention as opposed to tradition. And tradition always includes thinking, and I think it's in response to things like the recent calamity and the recent unpleasantness that we have to think a little bit harder and come up with newer types. So this has been very interesting as far as I'm concerned, and I hope everybody else has gotten some good stimulation out of being here. Mike and I thought we'd start off by asking the panelists to ask questions of each other that they may have, and then we'll open it up to everybody else for Q&A. What's our time frame? I guess how long do we have total? About 15 minutes total. 50 minutes. Oh, so we can yammer on and on and on. So when I start getting the flashcards from the back, I'll wrap it up. But until then, let's have a dialogue and a conversation. So I'll start off by asking the panelists, anybody feel free to jump first, to ask a question of another panelist that you have. Andrew.
A couple of you guys presented variations on a townhouse prototype or two-story over flats or things like that in an urban context, Baldwin Park. What were the parking requirements that you dealt with, or were they fully parked according to previous city parking requirements, or did you get them reduced? Can you talk about that?
Sure, I'll jump in. And it's all over the place. We showed it all over. Typically, we are getting some kind of parking reduction from the existing regulations. Baldwin Park is an exception. If you can think back to that plan image, you saw all of that surface parking, and there's quite a lot of surface parking. You could think of a bigger grant. So they're big blocks, but they're bounded blocks all around. So that's one way to get around to deal with parking as it's required. Some of the structured parking, it's all about the economics of do you go down another level. We also showed some accessible work, handicapped accessible work, and you can often get a parking reduction depending from the jurisdiction's requirement, depending on what the proportion of accessibility is, with the assumption that the need is right there. Similarly with senior housing. So some of that, like urban townhouse stuff we were looking at was like less than 1 unit per acre, like 0.8, probably blended across the accessible and non-accessible units. And even that first project, the College Park in Memphis, was an interesting zoning because it was a redeveloped public housing site that was technically city property and was waived from all zoning requirements. So we basically used existing streets and on-street parking for all of that to meet the parking. Basically what the yield was what the parking requirement wound up being under the PUD. Those are a little bit further separated, so you have more linear frontage of street to park it, that wound up close to 1 unit, 1 space per unit, but less than, but didn't really have a requirement.
Anyone else want to address that?
And your concept for these prefab, I mean, are you assuming any parking all underground? What's your thought?
Well,
I was thinking about that as you're talking, and the difference between New England and probably the rest of the country is it hasn't experienced the growth, for lack of a better word, that other parts of the country have. So that cities in New England are still, I mean, they're dysfunctional, and there's a lot of buildings torn down. I calculate about 2/3 of it, but it's really a problem of demolition. So that, for example, this project that I showed, there are within, I calculated within a 3-minute walk, there were over 1,000 parking spaces available for that project. And I think that that's the difference between maybe some of these other places where things are more distant from each other, and parking is a bigger issue. In New Haven, where this was, you really can pretty much walk to almost all your needs. And so really, what you need a car for is when you want to go some distance, and there is a pretty adequate zip car and those kind of alternatives, which actually end up being a lot cheaper than owning a car, and can handle most of the needs.
But in terms of what the local government requires, I mean, I understand the lifestyle, you can lead a lifestyle without a car, but I mean,
Yeah, well, there was
does the city take that into account?
remember there was underground parking,
Yeah,
which I kept,
yeah.
and so and there is a history in New Haven. I think they require 2 cars for dwelling units. There is a history of them forgiving that. But I think it wasn't 2 cars, but it was probably 1.5 cars.
I think you have to be politically expedient too. I mean, just put on my developer hat is, if I'm looking at your model, what I would want to know in that area politically, what can you achieve in terms of getting a lower parking requirement? You know, if the chances of getting having no parking requirement are really long odds, then I would go to Plan B and say, well, what if I could ask for 0.75 or 0.8, and then take your model and even if I had 2 50-foot lots, do a shared drive and park cars in the back, preserve the edge, do whatever you can, just to make sure that you come up with a model that small developers can use. So it's just a question of what are the chances, the political odds that you're going to get a zero parking requirement. If you think you can do it, great. But most places, most cities I've seen, I'm thinking of Norfolk. Roger, you remember? I think there was a downtown parking project. One of the first apartments down in the new park downtown Norfolk, I think, where they gave them like a 0.8. That was like a big deal to get down to that level. It was the first time they had done it, but that was exactly what you got your nose under the tent by getting that, and it made a huge difference for that particular project. So it couldn't get zero parking, but that made an enormous difference. So the trick is to come up with something where you can get it approved and then create an opportunity for everybody else who can look at those 50-foot lots.
Andrew, I didn't show any townhouses, but I wanted to just mention one thing quickly. On the Studio Sky blog, I posted something recently called Blocks and Boxes, which steps through a whole bunch of different types, including townhouses, and shows how that they all park, including park, if you count parking on the street and on the alleys, how they all park on to the just straight out of the box smart grid. So it might be a useful tool to look at that. As long as they'll let you count on street parking.
And your alley loaded, right? Which was your
Yes.
challenge, Andrew.
You have no alleys, right?
City manager, no alleys.
Does anybody in the audience have a comment to that, Ellen?
Well, it's the question actually following up on the zip car comment that Robert, has any city made a blanket sort of formula like, okay, if you provide X number of zip cars, we will reduce your on-site parking by X? Or even if it's not a blanket standard, are folks having any experience with negotiating, those kind of trade-offs with the services like Zipcar?
Well,
Or could we as CNU, should we be actually trying to pursue something like that, set a standard?
I think that cities in the Northeast are more hungry and therefore more open. We actually worked on a project with Steve Vaughn for another site close to the site. And I think we did not find a lot of, we had quite a bit of parking, but I don't think it got to the requirement. But there was quite a bit of openness to negotiate, and if we showed a certain number of Zipcar spots, I mean, they were open to that kind of thing. I think a bigger problem is that I was trying to address with this project is finding an openness to even doing a project, not from the city necessarily, but from property owners, developers who are just so tuned in to doing the private-public partnership kind of, big money deal. What I was really trying to do with this was trying to see if you can break that, if you can get down to a level where it's impossible to say no, and they still said no. And so it's sort of like this culture has been there so long, it's just sort of attracted those kind of fish, if you will.
But isn't it also, didn't we see it in Portland too? I remember there was a big discussion when CNU was there about how much parking lots were taxed, where it was vacancy, and if they did anything, the taxes went, just what your point was, it goes through the roof. So cities that have been progressive about this have looked at that issue, and they start to tax vacant land at a different rate to incentivize something to start happening. And
Require that kind of stuff.
yeah, and so your model is one where the city is not, if you're penalizing somebody if they put a building up, and you're giving somebody a break if they leave it as a vacant lot.
I think there's a wide range of city approaches to this. I'd say in Washington, D.C. is one that not just because of zip cars, but because of lots of different transit options. As a jurisdiction has been very willing to reduce parking counts. Within a metro, you can get 0.5 spaces per unit in places. At retail, you can get down to like 1.5 for 1,000 square feet of retail, which are really kind
Does
of
Hoboken have it in their code even?
Is Hoboken?
They have corner cars?
Right.
I mean, they call the corner cars that I think are provided by the city or something. But yeah,
It's also, to Robert's point, the developer's attitude. So
Yeah.
in DC, to get the urban target, the city put up half of the parking at that 2 spaces per 1,000 in order to get target. Half, and it's right on top of the metro station. Half of that garage is empty. The city is paying the bill, we're paying the bill every day on that. Half of that garage is empty. It's the only way they could get that national credit tenant in. And you see the same thing with bigger scale kind of developers. So even when you get the regulations on your side, it's really got to be a team approach to make it work.
Mike?
The other thing you might try is a zero parking requirement for one 50-foot by 100-foot lot per block, so that you don't concentrate potentially all the units with no parking in one area or the lower parking standard. And it might incentivize someone in that block to say, I'll do it, as a way to make development happen, because they don't have to meet a parking requirement.
Oh, so you mean somebody who loves parking can build the parking lot for the block?
No, somebody who wants to build 8 units on their 50 by 100-foot lot, the first one in wouldn't have a parking requirement. They get to build 8 units as a way to incentivize development.
Interesting.
Bob?
I don't know how common it is, but where I live in Durham, North Carolina, our downtown design district, which is about 130 acres, has 0 parking requirement, and doesn't seem to hurt anything.
I think it's interesting that parking is considered part of the land use or the lot and not part of the transportation system, where Zipcar kind of starts to erase that distinction. And I think that's an interesting way to think about it, because Zipcar kind of is more of a transportation thing,
But it alleviates the need for parking. I mean, it provides the car. But my sense is that Zipcar is probably more often in cities that already have the parking metrics turned upside down compared to the suburbanized.
It's in Atlanta.
Well, I stand corrected.
But it also often does really well, especially around universities or, I mean, there's different areas. But I've also heard of buildings where now the buildings not only have their own internal bike share, they'll also have their own internal car share as a way of saying, we're going to have 2 or 3 cars that anyone in the building can sign up for, just like they would sign up for Zipcar, and that knocks out 30 parking spaces.
Wow.
I don't know if they've been approved, but I've heard of people proposing that. I just don't know if it's actually ever
Back?
Sure, I'll just respond to the latest initial question about if any city has a code. I don't know of anyone that has a blanket code, but I know that I was part of a design team for a building in San Francisco that it had something like more than 50 units, like 7 floors, 7 units each. 10 Zipcar spaces, no other parking. But it had a lot to do with where it was. It was walkable to Amtrak and regional transit, and walkable to the downtown office core, and so it was pretty easy in that place to make the argument. And it was basically being set up as like corporate rentals or corporate condo. Like if you wanted to have someone do business in San Francisco, your company would buy a condo and your staff could use it anytime they want to. So all of that added up to, okay, no one, you guys don't need parking spaces as long as you have 10 zip cars. But I would suggest you follow San Francisco and Berkeley just to see what there's happened with their codes, because they tend to be leading a lot of these things.
I don't think San Francisco has required parking.
I know it's built, but I don't know how it works.
Next question on the panel.
Oh, well, I wanted to, if you see if you could expand upon make sure the audience understood the fair housing requirement. CNU's done a lot of work on trying to, work around some of these Fannie Freddie rules and FHA rules on first floor commercial. And as I'm sure many of you know, a lot of the small mixed-use buildings just don't conform to certain requirements. So at the first level, it's sometimes challenging to get construction money, and at the second level, it's really hard for a buyer if the second or third floor should become a for sale, a condominium, or cooperative apartment. It's really difficult to get an FHA approved loan because the building doesn't conform. So we've made a good deal of progress on that, and we're hoping the regs are going to come out this fall that are going to address that. But then there's another issue that goes along with it, which is the accessible unit on the first floor. And a lot of people have gotten caught up that don't have the knowledge of our speakers here this morning, but I want to make sure that everybody in this room, when you leave, if you have clarity on how this catches you. That's my
The FHA, the Fair Housing Act applies when you exceed if you have 4 units, and you have to have an accessible unit on the ground floor. And if the building has all flat units on the second level, you have to provide a way for a unit on the second level to be accessible, because that would be considered the ground floor for the residential portion. So in order to avoid having to provide any in the prototype, in order to keep the construction costs as minimal as possible, the idea is to create a walk-up building with a unit on the ground floor that would conform to the Fair Housing Act, so that one ground floor unit would meet the requirements of the Fair Housing Act.
And it's not just Freddie or Fannie financing, it's federal law. So even if you're developing with cash 4 or more units with all the living level with a unit has all the living level on one level, you need it to be accessible on the ground floor. And there is always a ground floor. So even if you're 1 story in the air above retail, that's the ground floor of the residential. So you either need to have a unit that has stairs in it to get out of that, so that's a townhouse, but not a handicapped accessible unit. Have less than 4 units, or have an elevator building. And all of these things sort of add to the construction cost. So as David's example showed, and the flex building at Baldwin, you'd simply put one unit on that retail ground floor as your handicapped accessible, fair housing compliant unit, and one bay of that retail, essentially retail component building meets your fair housing requirement. And when you've got a lot of those bays, you can leverage that. In a smaller project, you're giving one or four spaces up, that's harder to make happen. But there's really, this fair housing is something that
Is that rule applied per building or per project?
It's per
per
building.
building.
Okay.
You could have, if it's multiple buildings, they have to be separated, either by a party wall, essentially. Basically creating two separate buildings. You could still have four, you could have four units in a building without having an accessible unit if those 4 units are multi-level units. So, basically they're townhouse units. And you could have 4 units without having an accessible unit.
You could also connect 2 of those flex buildings essentially with just a breezeway, a climate-controlled breezeway that's enclosed, and that makes it one building from the fair housing perspective. And instead of doing one at each end or 2 increments, you can do one. It's another workaround.
Yeah, so the reason that's bringing that up is because I have a colleague who was doing like a Main Street neighborhood infill, and it was a retail location, and they had a good retail plan, and then he thought, oh, I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to put apartments on the 2nd floor, and ran into the thing, realized that they really couldn't do it because they were running afoul of this legislation. And it was a situation where in that context it wouldn't have been appropriate to have a residential unit on the 1st floor. It was a Main Street thing. It would have been sort of bizarre. So unfortunately they got caught that way, and they just didn't do it. They just did it when the retail was strong in the market, so you ended up with a 1-story building instead of could have been a 2- or 3-story building.
Can you save money elsewhere and afford an elevator is the other way we approach this. You get an elevator, you're done. If you thought it was a concrete building and could go to wood above concrete, can you then afford an elevator to get around your accessibility? So these are all part pieces of the moving parts.
Any other questions from the panel or observations or comments? Hearing none, I'll open it up to the floor. Anybody have any questions or observations? Phyllis?
Robert, the concept you have with 2 units with what sounded to me like a sort of co-housing, the
Sort of.
club that you talked about,
Yes.
what's the square footage for each of those units?
Forgetting, but it was 16 by 24 was the whole shebang. So after that, 8 by 24. Well, then there was a carve out for the stair and the hall.
Okay.
They're pretty small.
2 units shared the central kitchen, I assume? Just 2 units shared?
When I say kitchen, that's kind of an exaggeration.
But didn't you have one floor that had a big long dining table on it? That
Yeah,
was like
there was a loft. I call it the loft, which is actually the size of an extremely small apartment. That could either be shared by 2 bedrooms that could be rented separately, and then share the room that had more living quarters. I mean, it was set up so that you could mix and match all these things. I mean, you could have a bedroom 2 floors away from your living space. So that I did a lot of study of lifestyles, and frankly, this was the small unit. I had a baby boomer unit. Those were the other bigger ones that I didn't show, where they were more reasonable with multiple bedrooms and that kind of thing. But I was trying to do 2 things. One was to see if I could come up with numbers that would actually be appealing, where you didn't need to go to Wall Street, where you could go to individual people and even to a Funrise type of arrangement, although I understand Funrise has never actually funded anything except its own work. And also to get at a price point that seemed to be a no-brainer for millennials. I do think that the more millennials that we can get into the cities, they seem to get it, and they are beginning to infiltrate city offices in the lower ranks. And I personally am finding that cities are at a tipping point. I think this is the year. It's not like a landslide, but suddenly you're getting people that actually know what you're talking about. And that's, I find that exciting. I don't know where that's going, but I have hope.
Next question, Roger. Steve and Eric, I'm really interested in the kind of the financial model of what you're doing in Belize and how that's working. I've kind of got separate impressions a little bit, not architecturally, but kind of what the planning model was between what Eric was showing and what Steve was showing. But they were the same project, right? Can you just talk about that a little bit? I mean, you showed some lots that were being bought from another developer. Is that the essential project, and what are they selling for it?
Well, the plan actually began with the worst possible conditions. First of all, it's made land. It's sand that's dredged up to make the land. And the original developer, really nice guy, but he just made literally like 7 fingers out into the water. So they're long cul-de-sacs. So we said, well, gee, what do we do with that? So we have this really enlightened new developer, and she's just absolutely wonderful. And she actually will listen to things, And we said, well, it's not possible to create a neighborhood with just long cul-de-sacs. So what we're ending up doing is literally creating a cross grain of paths. I mean, everything basically people get around either walking or golf carts. And so the cross grain actually has all these romantic high arch bridges that, the bridge over the canals. And so it transforms the worst possible condition into something I think may end up being fairly cool. But our it was actually sprawl repair before the sprawl got built, other than just the land. The land got built and that was it. And then to try to say how do you retrofit that to something, at the early stage.
It's very interesting. The lots were fixed. They still are fixed at a 50-foot by 80-foot. That is something, the entire process there is so very difficult that we, except in rare instances, couldn't break that 50-foot by 80-foot increment on all of these fingers. So part of the planning challenge was that in these units, and of course you saw part of what we were doing was we were densifying the area considerably. We started with, this is one of the big things about the developer, she jumped in and said, let's do our, let's go ahead and jump in our T4, let's do this new stuff going quickly. So you saw that the taller buildings, it's like we had shops that are mixed use and equipment parking involved. And the model in that area is set up for permanent residents as well as kind of a hotel. So we kind of mixed into the entire plan with the same units at this point of development. We will be feathering out and actually ramping up in some other areas of the project. And this is kind of like, core together.
One thing to note, really interesting there, and that is that because of the fact that what she did was to create those single crew workplaces that was mentioned earlier, that actually the first 2 buildings built were those 2 live works, the little eatery, drinkery, and then the of course office next door. And that, of course, that's utterly impossible if you build the bigger set that you normally think you need to build. But if you build single crew workplaces, all sorts of things are possible that are utterly impossible at a larger scale.
Can you say what you mean by single crew workplace?
Yeah, basically for a restaurant. If anybody's from Boston, if you know Mike and Patty's in Bay Village, it's Mike serves and Patty cooks. So in a restaurant, the single crew is 2 people, a cook and a server. Okay. In a bed and breakfast, the single crew is 1 housekeeper who can do 8 rooms a day. They tell me. I've never done it, but that's what they say. And you know, so what we need to do, you know, you can actually have a 1-person grocer. There is one in Buford. You know, so we need to actually be thinking about what are these, you know, what's the actual atomic element of this business, because you can literally have the entire town in business pretty quickly if it's with single crew workplaces that might have to wait years or even decades to get the number of rooftops you need to have a 40,000 foot grocery or whatever.
Roger, the
Yeah, Bruce?
starting prices, just under 200.
Bruce?
I'm just wondering, because a lot of these are converging on the shop house type, which is known all over the world, or is used all over the world, and maybe not so much known here. But you know, basically, it's like a row house with what we call a flex house. But what are since you're not actually hitting them, what are the impediments to actually doing those? Just like a row house with the flex space.
You mean like why not do the obvious
Well,
row
I'm
house?
just saying, you know, it's like
Or the already figured out type?
they're on every continent except for Antarctica, and I wouldn't be sure about that. And nobody's, I mean, you're sort of converging on it, but you're not there. And I'm wondering, obviously people know about the type, so what's holding it back?
Let me just say one thing that in this audience wouldn't be considered inflammatory, but that it might be in other audiences. But that is that working at home ought to be considered a basic human right.
Tommy?
Whatever that makes me, I think that should be.
I think you heard that FHA is an impediment for ground floor retail, but then you have to have a ground floor accessible unit too. So how do you fit both?
Well, if it's a house, you don't. I mean, if it's just a flex house, basically. Take a row house and jack it up 9 feet, put in a shop. That's what I mean.
Well, you know, it's interesting that there's something building up to that. I was in Somerville, Massachusetts, not which is out, and there are these maker spaces which are thriving in Somerville. I mean, they're all over the place. And when you go into there and you look at what they're doing, and they're all these little companies, and they're not making apps. That's what a co-working space. They're all making apps for iPhones. So these people are actually making things and printing things, and it's not a far stretch to see where these kinds of people would like to be living closer to what they're doing, and this whole industry might then begin to move into the shop house.
You know, I think in a funny way, we got to a shop house concept in Union Beach, New Jersey by accident, because in some cases I mentioned that FEMA regs said, okay, you had to be at 5 feet or so. But everybody said, no, let's bring them up to have 9 clear so they can park a car under it. And then there developed this whole bunch of discussion with the building inspector, everybody else about, well, yeah, but now you've got all this other space under the house. Because it's, you know, the house is 62 feet deep, it's on a 100-foot lot. So they wanted to make sure that the undercarriage looked good, because, you know, people are going to do stuff on that first floor in the back, right? And I said, well, yeah, well, we need some electrical outlets out here and some other thing. I mean, they really were
they weren't thinking about, I mean, this was the building inspector and the people from Union Beach administrative staff. They realized that there was a newfound area where people could do stuff. And I was seeing discussions about skill saws and, how do you, get something done, or where do you put your entertainment area. It was wild, but it was almost like a found shop. And I could see those spaces somehow over the years being, transformed into all kinds of different things, just because the space was there.
And actually, a number of us that were designing Katrina cottages after the storm kind of accidentally hit upon, hey, why don't we just raise these up and have a shop underneath? So there's actually a number of those designs that exist from various people that kind of just stuck. There was sort of an accidental late one night sort of thing. Why don't we just raise these up?
There is a forest of impediments, though, which I think is what you're getting at. Depending on the kind of use that's down there, if it's you can get fire separation uses and egress and accessibility issues that we talked about for the residential unit itself, and then zoning issues, and there's no shortage of financing issues when you go to get a loan for it, if you try to treat that as income producing space or something, then the banks look at you funny. And so there's quite a few snakes in that wood pile that most of us have gotten bit by at some point, and we've kind of inoculated ourselves to not even think about them anymore. So it's worth bringing up and repeatedly, because another thing that I think is I've seen happen a lot is that, and somebody was asking about live works at lunch. With the recession, that did a lot to knock the wind out of it, because now you're talking about a house that instead of that you could barely qualify for just the living portions of it, and to add the purely workspace portions of it made the just qualifying for the loan from the end user that much harder. And I think and parking requirements get kicked in. And all this presupposes that your zoning can allow it in the first place, which there are very few places that have the mixed-use zoning for a real, beyond home occupancy. Almost every jurisdiction, I think, is pretty standard to have home occupancy, which is, yes, you can use your laptop in your dining room. We're not gonna storm down your door. But when you're talking about a place that serves the public, where it's a retail or quasi-retail use, where then that's where all these other things get triggered, especially on the zoning side. And now there's a ton more of those places existing now, thanks to new urbanism, but they're still fairly rare in the entire landscape of where things are getting built. Did you have yeah?
Yeah, Steve, you were talking about the changes that CNU's been working on in mixed-use percentages. Is that similar to the percentages you're talking about? The 20?
Exactly. There are different ways that the commercial limits for first floor are calculated. One is as a percentage of the whole building space.
Okay.
Another one is a percentage of income that the building throws off. And basically the argument that it started with the NTVA, we brought the CNU, now we've got RPA and ULI and the NAR, and everybody else signed on to this letter and this proposal that we try to get FHA to increase the percentages that are allowable so that they would qualify for a federally insured.
Right, I thought I read something that it was going toward 35%.
Yeah, that is where they're going. And they did, one regulation was written that's gone out, that's in the public, but we're not all the way we need to be yet, because basically what happens is the person in Austin, Texas, who's reviewing your building probably isn't aware of the regulation that was written back by somebody else. And so there's a whole series of things. We've been told that these changes are going to be made. There's been a lot of cooperation, which is a great thing. We're not quite there yet, but we've made a lot of progress. We'll see.
This is the Live, Work, Walk initiative that you'll see on the schedule this week. Laura Heary, who was here earlier, Mark Train, Kurt Rolos, Steve Mon and others are involved in that. If you see any of those sessions, there's a few of those coming up. It's a pretty interesting and exciting thing. And one of the things that Kurt's advising on is dealing with it as an asset class to kind of break through some of the financing impediments. And Mark's advising on that as well. So it's pretty cool stuff going on in that initiative. Any more questions? I have a question for the panelists. Each of you is kind of rethinking, as I was saying earlier, rethinking your mousetrap from the lens of one particular aspect of it, whether it's the FHA and some of the building code things that I thought it was interesting between what David and John are doing and what Torty Gallus are doing. You're kind of pushing the building code questions at the opposite end of the spectrum. Torty Gallus is kind of looking at how big can we go with wood, and Anderson Kim are looking at how small can we go, or how small can we go to make it financeable to mere mortals, which I think is pretty interesting. So each of you are kind of, Steve Mon's looking at the production and delivery, and Steve Mouzon is looking at how the work is done. So each of you is looking at a particular lens. What have you found to be the biggest aha or the biggest kind of takeaway from having the approach that you've taken? For example, Steve, you've mentioned that you've in all the work in modular, you kind of figured out, well, it makes sense where you've got high labor costs. Are there other things like that or analogous things that each of you have learned from your studies? Or do you want to expand on other things that you've learned about the place of modular in the world?
Well, I mean, I'll just start with that one briefly, but it's very sensitive to labor cost. That's really a critical thing. It's also very sensitive to transport. So even though some of these, the better manufacturers, if you're in their factories, you'll see they're just extraordinarily efficient. Extraordinarily. The waste there is no waste. It's kind of amazing what they can do. So there are these operational efficiencies that sort of, blow you away when you look at it. But then you get back to the sort of the age-old problem of you have to transport these things. So transporting, a house across a highway is just not efficient. So again, location is critical. And how do you make something in a factory? I don't care whether you're making it to Walmart or somehow they can make things, in Southeast Asia and ship them back, to America, and it's $6.22 on the shelf. But I think with modular in America, it's just a really big country, and the highways are really long, and those transport costs are significant. Now, I don't know why that competitive edge is much, which I find fascinating, because you think about the stick-built house, all the materials are transported too.
And extra materials because there's so much more waste.
Because there's more waste.
Still has to be hauled off the site.
Right. And I've also just observed there tends to be lower get wages. Guys in the factories that work in modular have real jobs. They're real with benefits. And if you look at some of the low-price builders around the Atlanta area in the Southeast, their labor costs are really low, and there aren't any benefits. And guys are sitting on the corner wondering if they're going to be, pointed to say, okay, get in the truck. You got a job today. Yeah. So that's what you're competing against. So some of the stick builders have dramatically lower labor costs. So it's an interesting model. It's not the only model. That's why I say you really have to understand where it fits into the picture. And it can be extraordinarily energy efficient. You can do amazing things in a factory. But again, it's price point. So whether you're, if you do a HUD house, I think a lot of these things, these manufactured houses have 3-inch exterior walls. And if you do one of the modular houses, Mary Ann's design, you know, it's 9-foot ceilings, 8-foot front door, 6-inch walls, you know, super insulation, and, you know, a lot of really cool features, but, you know, it all depends on what the design is. So it's an approach, it's not an answer for everything.
Well, I was thinking that transportation for modular is actually pretty inefficient when you compare it to the bulk that you can put on that same truck of just 2x4s. And so when you're transporting a box, you're transporting a lot of air.
Yeah.
It might be 50,000 pounds, but when you load up an 18-wheeler, you can get, you know, hundreds of thousands of pounds on that truck. So you've got the same labor driver, you're paying the same taxes through the states. And so it's really a matter of vertical integration that has never been looked at. And I just finished a book I highly recommend by Mark Levinson, who talks about A&P and how
The grocery store?
the grocery store, that they were basically killed by the same regulation that we're all talking about when they didn't ever do anything. They never were a monopoly. They never took out any other businesses. They never robbed any employees from some company to another. They just really figured out vertical integration. And how to make, they had something like 30,000, they were the world's largest retailer when they finally were put out of business. And most of their stores were 1,000 square feet with your one crew working them. And they had figured out how to get the price down of all those products. And they got put out of business by people that didn't like it, that their prices were so cheap, basically. But so it's really figuring out housing on that A&P model, where you're gonna see the.
Well, you know, I mean, we have some very sophisticated, you know, housing manufacturers in this country, and this housing is the most studied business that's ever been studied. Everybody has a different solution as to, you know, how to make it efficient. And if you look at like at a Pulte home, I mean, every inch of that house, you know, they do you know, panelized construction, but every inch of it is assembled in a factory, it's shrink wrapped, and then it's shipped to the site with a number on it. Every nail is in the house kit. And so, I mean, Robert could have built the house even, you know, but it would have been.
Whoa, wait a minute.
No, but I mean, it's quite remarkable the way that they've analyzed. They came up with their solution, how they do it. They still have to ship and put it together, but their ability to control cost and waste in their manufacturing process is pretty astounding. It doesn't answer any of our issues about urbanism or, you know, why we like the houses or don't like the houses, but they can be extremely efficient. And we know that the stick builder is the least efficient model, the individual builder, because there's waste on the site and it's kind of all over the place. And sometimes he goes home at night and remembers to set up the delivery for the next day and call his sub and tell him he should be there on Thursday. And sometimes he doesn't. He forgets and the day slips and the time slips, and you wonder why your house isn't ready yet. So there's only a certain amount of management skill on the small builder. So, you know, the quality of the building and the construction and how you manage all those pieces is all over the place, and certainly in the United States.
I think we've got time for one last question. Aaron?
I was just going to piggyback off the back of that and say, in terms of modular, you know, IKEA, as they say in the you know, has built an entire model around flat pack versus shipping air. But you know, there are two other aspects to you know, to shipping modular boxes. One is you were talking about the 15-foot limitation on the width of the actual package. That also has to be moved as a wide load, which requires vehicles at the front and back or.
No, if you go over 16, you need the flag thing. If you're wider, then that's the limit. We always try to define it as a limit. You didn't need the extra carriers, which is an extra cost.
And because it's because it really
generally these things are built so that they can only be moved once, because that's really what you're trying to do. There's a limited distance over which you can move it, or else the thing starts to rack apart. And so that's, that's another issue in the way that they put it together, and has to have a certain amount of stability. So all those add to the cost of why that happens. And as you said, there's some extraordinarily good modular builders in this country, but they're still working within the limits of business.
Right, absolutely. And there was another modular builder I was looking at recently, and their model was quite different, where they would build boxes that were like 14 by 18. So their theory was build a smaller box. If you build a small, you can get a couple on a carrier. Now the problem is that to build the same house, where let's say we might have 2 boxes that were long boxes, they might have 8 boxes that were all smaller. So the it's really the jury's out that was their model, because then what happens is your crane set time is greater. If you're lifting more boxes, it's a more complex set, and so that can cost you more money. But there's every possible approach has certainly been looked at these things. But again, I think modular is really efficient if you're in a reasonable distance from a quality factory, and you have a demand for a certain number of units at a certain time. In a cost structure, it's probably unbeatable, really, in some ways. But if you're just building a house at a time, kind of going along, it's probably more efficient to use stick construction.
I think we did it. 7 great presentations and interesting discussion after. So thank you all, and thank you all for coming.